Hi guys, Brook Potter here. This is the third video in my series where we're examining some of the different aspects about the ministry of Jesus. In my first video, we discussed the significant role that the law of Moses played in Jesus' first century ministry to the nation of Israel. And in that video, I made the statement that Jesus basically came as a rabbi or a teacher of the law, and he taught the law back to the nation of Israel. But he also used prophecy and the parables to foretell of the new covenant and lay some of the foundations of the grace that was to come. In my second video, we actually examined some of the prophecies of Jesus Christ and how many of them were seen as unique, seeing as he made prophecies in the present tense, of which the fulfillment of many of them was actually not going to occur until after his death, burial, and resurrection. And in this video, we're going to be examining some of the parables of Jesus as to why he used them, some of the different types, and even some of the difficult ones. Now, I'm not saying that I have perfect understanding about all the parables, but I'm just going to share some of the insight and some of the things that I use to help interpret them, so hopefully some of you might be able to understand them a little bit better. Now, the first question that I'm usually confronted with is, why is it that Jesus employed parables in his public ministry to begin with? In fact, this was the exact same question that the disciples asked him in the book of Mark chapter 4, verse 11 to 13. And Jesus for them actually quotes a messianic prophecy that foretold that the Messiah would actually use parables in his ministry. And this quote, of course, comes from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, which speaks about the Messiah will speak unto a people, and he will basically make them heavy of hearing and deaf of all the different teachings, and they would not understand the things he was saying, lest they convert and be healed. Now, the reason for that second part is simply this. Jesus Christ actually operated his earthly ministry under the old covenant. And as a result, Deuteronomy 4:2 actually makes the statement that nobody can add anything to the law, neither can they say anything to diminish the law. In other words, Jesus' ministry under the law, he had to preach the law. He was not permitted to spin around and say something like, well, don't worry with all this stuff with Moses because there's this new thing coming called the new covenant, and all of this temple and worship and animal sacrifice and these other things is going to be done away with, so don't worry with that for today. If he had done that, he would have been guilty of diminishing the law. But the way that he got around that is by the use of parables, where he was able to speak many of the new covenant truths in a public arena and technically not violate the law because the audience he was speaking to actually did not understand what he was saying. It is the same reason that many of his prophecies were used, as prophecy was a way to get around the confines of the law and speak many of the truths of the new covenant that was to come. Now, of course, Jesus employed many parables in his earthly ministry, and I'm not going to be able to go through all of them in this video. So forgive me if I paint with some pretty broad strokes, but I'm going to highlight a few things that might help people understand some of the cultural significance and Jewish idioms that are recorded in these parables to help people understand a little bit more about what's being said. Now, the first parables that I'm going to look at, of course, for those of us who are familiar with the New Covenant, are the parables of grace. And many of them are simply a reflection of the Father's heart. Parables, for instance, as the vineyard owner in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. The vineyard owner hires laborers for the day to work in his vineyard and decides to pay each of them a penny a day. But then he goes out multiple times during the day and recruits other laborers. Some will work only half a day and some as little as 1 hour. And at the end of the day, he pays those that have only worked an hour the same wage as those who have worked the entire day. Again, demonstrating the principle that, whether you've worked a lot or a little, the reward was the same. Of course, the prodigal son is another example of a parable of grace, again showing the father's heart that even though his son had wished him dead and he had divided the inheritance and his son had squandered the inheritance, because of the perception of the father being fair to his servants in his house, this was the thought that came to the prodigal son's mind while he was in the pig pen. It was the remembrance of the goodness of his father towards even the least of his household, the servants, that actually got the prodigal son to consider rising up out of the mire and returning to his father's house. And we see from the narrative that the father at no point considered the son, even though he was with the pigs, anything less than a son and a full heir to the inheritance of all the father possessed. And again, this shows an example of the father's love. The flip side of that, of course, is again the older brother. But again, we see that the father's heart was such that even if the older brother was outside of the celebration of the younger brother, the father's heart was such that he would go to the older brother. So again, these are very good examples showing the heart of the father as we see it later reflected in the new covenant. Other such parables that reflect the father's heart are such parables as the man who finds a treasure in a field, or the merchant seeking the pearl of great price, or even the widow that seeks to find the lost coin of the 10 coins that she has and she sweeps out the house. Now, some people have taken these parables to imply that we are such people, that Christians are the one who are seeking the great pearl and who are seeking the great treasure and these other things, and we are the ones who must give everything up to attain the treasure of the kingdom of heaven. But I don't actually believe that is the reflection. I believe that God is the one who is the merchant who is seeking the great pearl, or the person seeking the treasure in the land, or he is the widow woman that sweeps out the house to find that which is lost. These are parables reflecting Jesus and the Father as the good shepherd that goes after the lost sheep. And it is God's relentless pursuit of that which is lost. So while some people might try to interpret this and put an obligation on believers to say that we must give all we have, I believe actually the proper interpretation would be that of Jesus Christ, who gave all that he had to purchase us, humanity, at a great price to himself. And we are actually the ones with the treasures hidden in earthen vessels. Now, the next set of parables that I want to look at are the parables of judgment. Now, I have seen all types of New Testament students and scholars do all sorts of gymnastics to try and lessen the severity of many of these judgment passages. And I don't think any of that is really necessary when we understand the context and the cultural significance of what is happening in the ministry of Jesus. Now, we must understand that, first of all, Jesus was sent to Israel in the same way that Jonah the prophet was sent to Nineveh. In both cases, the nations had slipped into apostasy and God was about to destroy the nation. So much of the judgment language is actually directed to national Israel. Now, I want to stress firmly that it was never God's heart that he wanted to judge the nation of Israel. In fact, that is a very large reason why Jesus was sent, that he would actually try to turn Israel away from its coming destruction. But the fact of the matter is that God had entered into a covenant with Israel. And the covenant not only bound Israel, but it also bound God. God was not only their covenant partner to defend them and prosper them and these other things, but when Israel disobeyed, God had also become their punisher. And when we read in Leviticus 28, we see the number of curses that come upon them because of their disobedience. The final judgment that was supposed to befall Israel was actually foretold by Moses at the end of Deuteronomy 31. He then goes on to prophesy, recorded in Deuteronomy 32, all the destruction that was going to befall the nation of Israel because of their continued disobedience to the law. Now, I want to stress again, the law was not a clear reflection of God's heart, but he bound himself to it, and as a result, he was forced, according to the covenant, to punish Israel for their continued disobedience. His last warning to them was, in fact, to send forth his son. And Jesus, as part of his earthly ministry, not only taught the law, but he used the parables as a means to continuously warn them that unless they repented and turned back to the law and, gave up many of their idols and these other forms of spiritual adultery, they were now in danger of national judgment. And he was warning them that judgment was coming. Jesus himself attested to this judgment in his ministry in Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, where Jesus makes the statement that, "Don't think that I've come to bring peace on the earth. I haven't come to bring peace, but a sword." The sword he's referring to, at least in the minds of the first century Jews that he was speaking of, would have been the sword depicted in Ezekiel 21 verses 1 to 5. It was the sword of the Lord that was coming against the nation of Israel in national judgment, again because of all of their disobedience. So the judgment audience of many of these parables is in fact national Israel. Jesus further qualified much of his judgment language in the book of John chapter 15 verses 1 and 2, where Jesus goes on to describe that he is the true vine and the Father is the husbandman. And in verse 2 it goes on to say that any branch that does not bear fruit is actually going to be taken away. Now, I've seen theologians try all sorts of gymnastics to try and suggest that the branch isn't actually taken away, it's actually lifted up, and it's actually supposed to be pruned and all these other things to try and soften the language. But in fact, this theme is reflected by the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans chapter 11 verse 20 and 21, where Paul says that the natural branches, being Israel, were in fact broken off, that the wild branches, which was the Gentiles, could be grafted in by faith. Now again, this type of sentiment and this type of language suggests that the breaking off of the branches was a form of judgment against national Israel. Israel is identified as the unfruitful branch in this context. A clear example of this judgment towards the nation of Israel is the parable about the unfaithful servant, as recorded in the book of Matthew chapter 18 verses 21 to 35. The narrative begins with Peter asking Jesus how many times he should forgive his brother, if 7 times is sufficient. Jesus responds with a prophetic significant statement of 70 times 7. Now, I've heard all types of preachers spin around and suggest that that basically means infinity and that he should forgive his brother, every time he asks. But the 490 is actually a quote from Daniel chapter 9 verse 24, where the angel is interpreting Jeremiah's prophecy to Daniel and basically says that Israel has been given 70 weeks of years, or 490 years, in order to get their act together to follow the law, otherwise they were going to bring about destruction upon themselves. That is the context of which we enter into the story about the unfaithful servant. The unfaithful servant in this case is national Israel. They were the only ones that God could have made any kind of demands upon because they were the only nation with a covenant with God. Israel is basically brought before the Lord and told to pay all that they owe, which was to upkeep the standards of the law. We understand that in the parable that the servant worships the king and he asks for time. He does not ask for mercy. But that is what the king extends to him, that in that space he says, I've forgiven the debt and you're free to go. The servant, as we know, then goes and roughs up another person and does not extend the same courtesy that the servant had received. When the king had gotten word of this, of course, he drags the servant back in and basically puts him under the into the hands of the tormentors until he pays all he owes. Now, again, the significance of Israel is this, is that Israel was extended mercy upon mercy upon mercy. And they should have therefore in turn treated the Gentile nations and the foreigners in their surrounding area with the same mercy that they were extended by God. But in effect, they didn't. And because they failed to extend that same mercy under the law, they were thereby the nation was scattered amongst the Gentiles, which in this case was the tormentors, until they had finally paid back all that they owed, in that sense, in terms of fulfilling the requirements of the law. And we know that they were under Roman occupation, which was the tormentors, for many years, and ultimately the Roman Empire destroyed the city. Now, another reason we know that this is not talking about hell and the afterlife is because the punishment was temporary. The unfaithful servant was tormented until he was able to pay back all that he owed. So again, the context of this entire parable is speaking about national Israel. For us in the New Covenant, we are not servants, we're actually sons, and we're also kings and priests. We would be on the other side of this equation in the New Covenant. So again, this is a great example of a parable that is speaking to national Israel and speaking about their disobedience under the law and how they've been oppressed by these foreign nations for so long because they had failed to live up to the law and treat the other nations with the same mercy that they had received. Jesus himself used these judgment parables as a stern rebuke to the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jerusalem. These judgments are scattered all throughout the writings of the New Testament, but especially in Matthew 21 and in Luke 16. In Matthew 21, in verses 33 to 46, we get the story of a landowner who plants a vineyard, and then he entrusts the care of the vineyard to the husbandman while he goes off on a far journey. As time goes on, the landowner sends his servants back to the husbandman to receive the fruit of his vineyard. They beat one and they kill the other. The husbandman then decides that he's going to send forth his son, thinking that they will respect his son. But the husbandman then plot to kill his son and therefore receive the inheritance and take it for themselves. Jesus then turns to the Pharisees who are listening to this parable and asks them what should be done with these wicked husbandmen. And they respond that the Lord, when he returns, should destroy these wicked men and entrust the care of the vineyard to other husbandmen, hopefully those that are more trustworthy. Jesus then turns around and says that this is actually a parable speaking against them, the leaders of Israel. That they are the ones who have been entrusted with the vineyard, which was the nation of Israel, and they are the ones who have repeatedly not helped produce the fruit that the Lord required. And ultimately, the destruction that they spoke should come upon the wicked husbandman in the parable was ultimately the very thing that was poured out upon them in the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Now, in a closing thought, not all of Jesus' parables are as clear-cut to understand. One of the most controversial of Jesus' parables that he used to rebuke the high priest and the religious leadership is recorded in the book of Luke, chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. I am, of course, referring to Lazarus and the rich man. Now, I'm not saying that I have full understanding of this parable, but I would like to point out a few different things that help people come to different understandings about this same parable. Again, I'm not saying that I'm right, I'm just sharing some insight that people can use in their personal study to try and understand these parables a little better. The first interpretation is one where we understand from verse 19 that the rich man is clothed in purple and linen. And in Jewish culture, the purple was symbolic of royalty, and the linen, of course, is symbolic of the priesthood. And we also learn in verse 28 that goes on to say that the rich man is actually recorded to have had 5 brothers. Now, the ideal candidate in the first century could very well have been Caiaphas, the high priest, who served both as the high priest and in a theocracy also as royalty. But it is also recorded in the works of Josephus that Caiaphas actually had 5 brothers. So it's quite possible that Jesus is using this parable to suggest that the high priest and the leadership were actually going to be cast into destruction, while Lazarus, on the other hand, was considered the average Jew who was out there, who didn't have this high prestige that could actually be the inheritor of the kingdom of heaven. A second interpretation as to the identity of the rich man could equally be applied to the kingdom of Judah. As we know from scripture, Judah was the offspring of Leah, and he actually had 5 brothers. But also in that, the kingdom of Judah had its capital as Jerusalem, which would therefore fulfill the priestly and the kingly requirements. Now, this understanding would actually bring about an interesting interpretation to the Lazarus character in this parable. When we read about Lazarus, he is a beggar, spiritually bankrupt, and he is amongst the dogs, and he longs to eat the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table. Now, there is a second place in Scripture where this parable about, this narrative about eating crumbs from the master's table is actually found. And it's found in the book of Luke, chapter 15, verse 27, in reference to the Gentile woman seeking out Jesus for the healing of her daughter. Jesus refers to the woman as a dog, and the woman's response is, "True, Lord, but even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." When we compare scripture with scripture, this could in fact be a reference to the Gentiles. As we know, the root meaning of the word Lazarus actually comes from Eliezer in the Old Testament, which was the faithful servant of Abraham, but he was also a Gentile. So a possible interpretation for this parable could be the destruction of Jerusalem and the priestly system, and the kingdom being delivered into the hands of the Gentiles. Now we know that if the Pharisees and the high priest had heard this, there would have been nothing that was more offensive to them than the idea that the Gentiles, who they basically considered dogs, were going to be introduced and accepted into Abraham's bosom, or the promises of God. So I hope I've laid out a couple things that are interesting that will aid in your study to understand many of these parables. I'm not saying that I have full understanding. I hope I've just given some insight and clues that will help you in your study. I would like to thank you again for watching. Please subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more, and feel free to leave me a comment or questions or anything along these lines. Thanks again for watching, guys. I love you all, and I hope to see you all very soon. God bless you, and bye-bye.